A rising political star told Kash Patel to go back to India. What he said next silenced the entire nation. The lights in the CNN debate studio didn't just illuminate a stage, they exposed a nation, 2 chairs, 1 table, and enough tension to make the air feel sharp. Kash Patel adjusted his tie like a man preparing for more than just another political back and forth. Across from him sat Caroline Leavitt, younger, louder, sharper-edged, and dangerous in the way only someone with nothing to lose can be. The topic was supposed to be national security, policy, numbers, talking points, but this debate would never be about policy. It was always going to be personal. Caroline came in with a plan. Deliver a line that would make headlines and ignite her base. She believed she was prepared. She believed she knew her opponent, and in that confidence, she crossed a line that would haunt her for the rest of her career. When she told Kash Patel to go back to India, the room didn't just fall silent, it changed. Anderson Cooper froze. The camera crews hesitated. Even the studio lights seemed to dim in disbelief. Everyone expected Kash to flinch, to defend, to absorb the insult like so many had before him. But Kash didn't raise his voice. He raised the stakes. What followed wasn't just a clapback. It wasn't a moment in the social media sense. It was a takedown so precise, so calm, and so devastating, it made everyone watching, regardless of party, rethink what it means to be American. Within minutes, the clip would go viral. Within hours, political careers would shift. And by the end of the week, Kash Patel's quiet dismantling of Caroline Leavitt's attack would be studied in universities, rewatched in classrooms, and quoted in campaign speeches. But before that, McDrop moment reshaped the political landscape. There was history. There were lives. There were 2 people on that stage carrying stories far heavier than their titles. To understand the full impact of what happened that night, we have to go back. Back to where Caroline's rise began, and back to the immigrant story Kash was never supposed to weaponize, but did when the moment demanded it, because this wasn't just a debate. This was the reckoning of 2025. Before the fall, there was the rise. Caroline Leavitt's story wasn't born in privilege, but in a narrative that many conservatives found irresistible. Working-class grit, small-town pride, and a sharp tongue trained on anyone who dared to challenge her worldview. She was only 24 when she stepped behind the podium at the White House briefing room, the youngest press secretary in American history. To her supporters, she wasn't just another political appointee. She was the future. Blonde, bold, and battle-tested from years of conservative media training, she didn't hesitate to clash with legacy journalists twice her age. She relished the fights, invited them, and won them by out-talking, out-shouting, or simply outlasting her critics. By 27, she had a congressional campaign in motion. The American right loved her. She was fearless, telegenic, loyal, Trump's firebrand protégé who knew how to go viral with a single sentence. But Caroline's power wasn't just in what she said. It was in what she symbolized. To many, she represented the America First generation. Not Reagan's conservatism, not Bush's neoconservatism. Something newer, harsher, sharper. She didn't just debate the left, she humiliated them. She didn't just defend Trump, she echoed him, sometimes louder than he spoke himself. What made her dangerous wasn't her experience. It was her timing. She knew how to provoke outrage on command. She had mastered the formula, a headline, a clip, a trend. And then came the decision to run for Congress, a natural next step, or so it seemed. In campaign ads, she spoke about faith, family, freedom. But behind the curtain, her strategy was simple: divide and dominate. Identify the weak point, exploit it, weaponize the crowd. If her opponent stumbled, she pounced. If they hesitated, she smiled. But her secret weapon wasn't policy, it was performance. By the time she sat across from Kash Patel under CNN studio lights, Caroline believed she was untouchable. She had survived controversy, thrived on chaos, and she assumed, arrogantly, that this night would be no different. She'd written her zinger the night before, practiced the delivery in front of mirrors. She wanted the moment that would go viral, the clip that would crown her as the GOP's new queen of confrontation. But what she hadn't rehearsed, what she never imagined, was what would happen when the man across from her didn't just fight back. He fought smart, and he knew more about her than she knew about herself. She thought this was a game of optics. She underestimated the weight of lived experience. While she counted viral clips and calculated applause lines, Kash Patel had spent decades counting the seconds between life and death on foreign soil, where silence wasn't a debate tactic, but a survival skill. And that's what made her dangerous. She was polished, but not prepared. Caroline entered the CNN studio with a kill shot scripted, dressed not for discussion, but domination. She had done it before, used coded language, subtle jabs, phrases that could be interpreted a dozen ways. Enough to trigger a reaction. Just enough deniability to spin it afterward. But this time, she miscalculated, because the man sitting across from her wasn't a soundbite. He was a slow burn. Kash didn't need applause to validate him. He didn't need to dominate airtime to win. And most of all, he didn't need to stoop to her level to end her career. He just needed the truth, and he knew exactly when to use it. Backstage, producers whispered about ratings. Anderson Cooper's notes were prepped with policy questions, not contingency plans for a live implosion. No one knew that in the next hour, a pre-written takedown would meet an unrehearsed reckoning, and only one of them would walk out with their reputation intact. And Caroline, she had no idea the line she was about to cross would undo everything she'd built. Because while she studied performance, Kash had studied her, and buried in her own family's past was the one truth she couldn't spin. She thought this was a game of optics. She underestimated the weight of lived experience. While she counted viral clips and calculated applause lines, Kash Patel had spent decades counting the seconds between life and death on foreign soil, where silence wasn't a debate tactic but a survival skill, and that's what made her dangerous. She was polished, but not prepared. Caroline entered the CNN studio with a kill shot scripted, dressed not for discussion, but domination. She had done it before, used coded language, subtle jabs, phrases that could be interpreted a dozen ways. Enough to trigger a reaction. Just enough deniability to spin it afterward. But this time, she miscalculated, because the man sitting across from her wasn't a soundbite. He was a slow burn. Kash didn't need applause to validate him. He didn't need to dominate airtime to win. And most of all, he didn't need to stoop to her level to end her career. He just needed the truth, and he knew exactly when to use it. Backstage, producers whispered about ratings. Anderson Cooper's notes were prepped with policy questions, not contingency plans for a live implosion. No one knew that, in the next hour, a pre-written takedown would meet an unrehearsed reckoning, and only one of them would walk out with their reputation intact. And Caroline? She had no idea the line she was about to cross would undo everything she'd built, because while she studied performance, Kash had studied her, and buried in her own family's past was the one truth she couldn't spin. There's a moment, right before the tide turns, when even the crowd stops choosing sides, when applause feels dangerous, when silence feels sacred. That's where we were. This debate wasn't about immigration anymore. It wasn't about border security or party lines. It was about identity, about inheritance, about who gets to claim the microphone in a country made of contradictions. Caroline came with talking points. Kash came with lived history. And what he was about to reveal would force the entire country to answer a question it had spent centuries avoiding: who gets to call themselves American? Before Kash Patel ever stepped onto a debate stage, he had stood in places where speaking could get you killed. His story didn't start in Washington or on a campaign trail. It started in a one-bedroom apartment in Queens, New York, where his father came home every night smelling like taxi seats and concrete dust, and his mother cleaned office floors long after midnight. They never complained. They never expected shortcuts. They just worked. They had come to America from India in the 1970s with nothing but determination and a belief that this strange, loud, chaotic country might give their son a shot. And Kash. He never forgot it. While other kids talked about vacations, Kash memorized transit routes so he could help his dad stay awake behind the wheel. While classmates focused on yearbooks and dances, Kash was building discipline, grinding through school, learning the law, mastering the kind of silence that speaks louder than noise. He didn't come from generational wealth. He came from generational sacrifice. But what set Kash apart wasn't just where he came from, it was where he chose to go. While others took safe jobs, Kash walked into the belly of America's darkest threats. He became a federal prosecutor, then a counter-terrorism advisor, then a senior investigator on the House Intelligence Committee. At every step, he went deeper into the machine that protects a nation and exposes its deepest hypocrisies. He didn't ask for headlines. He operated in shadows. Kash ran point on classified missions that saved lives, dismantled cartels, and cracked through terrorist networks before most Americans had finished their morning coffee. He wasn't just loyal to America, he had bled for it, and yet none of that shielded him from suspicion. Not in politics, not in the media, not even on that CNN stage, because to some people, no matter how much you give, you'll always be the kid with the name they can't pronounce. So when Caroline Leavitt sat across from him and implied, without saying the words, that he was less American than she was, Kash didn't react. He recalled not just her words, but everything they represented. Because when you've risked your life for a country that still questions your place in it, you don't answer with anger, you answer with evidence. That's what made Kash dangerous. Not that he was angry, but that he was ready. While Leavitt crafted insults in makeup rooms, he was flipping through declassified files, learning to read between the lines of betrayal. He didn't need to shout. He knew how to wait, and when the moment came, he wouldn't need to prove his worth. He'd just reveal the truth. It wasn't just about the insult, it was about every door that had ever closed in his face. Every "you're so articulate" that pretended to be a compliment. Every fundraiser where he was the only one with a brown face and the only one who'd taken enemy fire. Because for Kash, this wasn't theoretical. He'd watched colleagues hesitate before calling him American. He'd sat across from donors who smiled at him, then mispronounced his name 4 times in a row. He had learned to survive the subtle betrayals, the way America sometimes whispers you belong, right before it asks for your birth certificate. So, when Caroline spoke those words she had polished for political gain, it wasn't just a jab at his identity, it was a declaration. And Kash, trained in intelligence, knew that declarations always leave paper trails. He had come prepared to follow hers back through time. This wasn't about winning a debate. This was about breaking a cycle. Because if he didn't push back now, on this stage, under these lights, what message would that send to every kid watching at home whose last name wasn't Smith or Jones? What would it say to every first-generation American sitting at a dinner table full of sacrifice? Kash wasn't just responding to Caroline, he was responding to a country still figuring out who gets to speak, and he was done asking for permission. There's a different kind of patriotism, the kind that doesn't wear flags, doesn't scream slogans, doesn't beg to be seen, it just endures, quietly, constantly. That's what Kash represented, not the version of America wrapped in stage lights and rehearsed talking points. but the one carried by immigrants who serve a country that still isn't sure it wants them. He didn't owe anyone a rebuttal, but he gave them something better. Not a defense, a reckoning. And when it finally came, it wouldn't sound like rage. It would sound like history. It started with a glance, not a word, not a shout, just a flicker in Caroline Leavitt's eyes, the kind that usually goes unnoticed unless you've spent years reading danger in silence. Kash saw it. So did Anderson Cooper. She had been waiting. Through 20 minutes of policy questions, Caroline smiled, nodded, performed. She played the part of the poised candidate, all strong borders and American values, but her fingers twitched with anticipation. She wasn't here to discuss immigration reform. She was here to redefine who counted as American, and her moment had arrived. Cooper had barely finished his question when she leaned forward, voice calm, smile polished. "Maybe it's time," she said. "You stop pretending to understand American values and went back to India where you belong." No stumble, no hesitation, just a blade hidden inside a sentence. For half a second, no one breathed. Even the lights seemed to freeze. Cooper blinked, lips slightly parted, not sure if he'd misheard. The studio audience gasped, a sharp intake of breath that cut through the stillness like broken glass. Kash didn't move, didn't flinch. The silence around him stretched so long, it became unbearable. Caroline sat back, satisfied. That was the clip she came for, the viral moment, the fire she thought would light her path to the next primary. She mistook the stillness for surrender. What she didn't see was that Kash wasn't stunned. He was choosing whether to destroy her with volume or with truth. He adjusted his cuff, adjusted his. Looked down once, looked up again. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, low, deliberate, sharp enough to cut through bone. "Miss Leavitt," he said, "I think you should be very careful about the road you're going down." But she wasn't careful. She was committed, the audience murmured. Cooper leaned forward, uncertain. CNN producers argued in their earpieces. Cut to commercial. Let it ride? Caroline doubled down. "Some of us understand America instinctively," she said. "Others will always be learning it from books." She didn't see the line she had just crossed, not just politically but morally, because this wasn't about Kash anymore. It was about every single person watching who had ever been told they didn't belong in their own country. And Kash. He wasn't going to speak for himself anymore. He was going to speak for all of them. "Some of us understand America instinctively," she said. "Others will always be learning it from books." The words hung like smoke. And in that moment, it wasn't just Kash Patel sitting across from her. It was every child of immigrants who had ever been asked, "But where are you really from?" It was every soldier who had come home in a flag-draped coffin, whose last name didn't sound Anglo enough for campaign posters. It was every diner cook, every rideshare driver, every ER nurse with an accent, watching someone question their right to belong. And the audience, they felt it. The applause never came, just a shift in the air, the kind of stillness that follows lightning right before thunder answers. In the back row, a woman in a hijab crossed her arms tightly across her chest. Beside her, an older man with a Vietnam War cap whispered something to his granddaughter, who stared wide-eyed at the stage. The lights didn't flicker, but something else did. Conviction, doubt, recognition. Anderson Cooper lowered his gaze. He knew this was no longer a debate. This was an autopsy, a live dissection of the lie America keeps telling itself, that belonging is inherited, not earned. Caroline didn't see it. She sat upright, proud of her line, unaware she had just severed something. Deeper than political alliance, she had ruptured the illusion that this was just about policy. And Kash still hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to, because the room had already turned. You could feel it in the eyes of the crowd, in the cameras that zoomed tighter not on Caroline, but on him. You could feel it in the silence that had weight, texture, gravity. He looked at her not with rage, not with pity, but with the knowledge of someone who has waited his whole life for a moment that mattered, and just before he spoke, he glanced toward the studio ceiling, where the American flag hung above them, as if to remind everyone watching, the question wasn't who belonged under that flag. The question was, who had actually earned it? Kash didn't blink, didn't rush, didn't raise his voice. He reached into his jacket slowly, like a man retrieving not a document, but a verdict. And when he laid the folder on the table, the entire debate changed shape. "You want to talk about who belongs in America?" Kash said, his voice controlled, deliberate. "Then let's talk about how we both got here." The folder didn't thud, it whispered. A soft sound, but loud enough to send a ripple through the studio. CNN cameras zoomed in, the producers now frozen, not cutting to commercial, not muting the feed. They knew what was coming. Everyone did. But Caroline? She didn't move, didn't breathe. She had built her political identity on a narrative of inherited Americanness. Real roots, she called it. But Kash was holding proof that even roots can lie. "Let's start with mine," he said, opening the folder. "My parents came to America in 1970. No money, no connections, no safety net, just dreams and work." He didn't have to embellish, he just told the truth. His father's 3 jobs: taxi driver by day, security guard by night, janitor on weekends. His mother's years cleaning buildings so he could learn inside them. "They didn't ask for handouts," he said. "They didn't expect a parade. They just believed in the promise of this country and made sure I was worthy of it." The audience was silent. This wasn't testimony. This was evidence. I became a prosecutor, worked undercover, risked my life to take down cartels and terror cells. I've been shot at. I've carried secrets I'll never be allowed to share. I've fought for a country that still, somehow, makes people like me prove we belong. He paused, just long enough to let the silence breathe. "But here's the part that might surprise you, Miss Leavitt." And then he flipped the next page. "Your family came here in 1892, immigrated from Canada." Gasps echoed around the studio. "Your great-grandfather, Thomas Leavitt, was denied entry. Twice. He didn't meet the income requirements. No job. No guarantees. He was the kind of immigrant your policies now oppose." Caroline's face drained of color. "On his 3rd attempt, he got in. Why? Because an Indian-American businessman vouched for him." The silence cracked. Some audience members laughed in disbelief. Others shook their heads. Caroline opened her mouth, but no sound came. Kash looked her dead in the eye. "So when you tell me to go back to India, you're telling the descendant of the man who helped your family come to America that he doesn't belong here?" He let that sentence settle. No rush, no drama, because truth doesn't need flair, it just needs oxygen. "You built your campaign on bloodlines, but bloodlines didn't bring your family here. Hope did. Immigration did, and help from someone who looked like me did." A beat. "So if I don't belong here, Caroline, maybe you should ask yourself why you do." Caroline didn't speak. She blinked once, then again, slower this time, as if trying to make sense of the fact that her entire political foundation had just been pulled out from beneath her by the very man she tried to erase. The studio remained deathly still. Anderson Cooper shifted slightly in his seat, but even he knew this wasn't his moment. It was Kash's. He hadn't just defended himself, he had redefined the battlefield. Caroline had walked in, believing her ancestry gave her authority. But now, her own great-grandfather's desperation had become her undoing, and worse, it wasn't. Whispered opposition that unraveled her, it was facts unforgiving, documented public. "You see," Kash continued, his tone measured, even gentle now, "your story isn't shameful. It's American, but it becomes dangerous when you try to weaponize your roots while denying others theirs." Caroline swallowed hard. A bead of sweat traced a path behind her ear. The crowd, still silent, was no longer neutral. They had shifted, not just in sympathy, but in understanding. Because what Kash had just revealed wasn't just about immigration. It was about legacy, about truth, about the difference between inherited pride and earned patriotism. "You weren't born guilty," Kash said. "You use your bloodline to question mine. That's not confidence. That's cowardice wrapped in a flag." He wasn't angry. He was finished, and that's what made it devastating. Caroline opened her mouth, this time to speak, but the words didn't come. She had memorized her talking points, but not the truth. She had expected applause, not reckoning, and for the first time in her young political career, she was staring down a truth she couldn't spin, a mirror she couldn't look away from. The folder still lay open between them, pages exposed like history's quiet receipts, and above them, the flag still hung, same stars, same stripes, but tonight it meant something different. Caroline's mouth tightened, not into a smile, into a shield. But it was too late for armor. Her mask had slipped, her lines were exhausted, and the silence she, once used as a weapon, was now circling back at her like a verdict, because Kash hadn't just answered her. He had exposed her, not with slurs, not with rage, but with receipts. And the real damage? It wasn't just what he said. It was the fact that everyone else in the room already knew it was true. One by one, the audience's expressions changed, not in unison, but in momentum. A slow erosion of confidence in her, a slow shift of trust toward him. She felt it, and for the first time in the debate, she looked not at Kash, but at the cameras. She was no longer speaking to him. She was trying to salvage her narrative, to reach the audience at home before the story wrote itself. "I'm not against immigrants," she said suddenly, "but we have to protect our culture. We have to preserve what makes America, America." Her voice had that edge again, but it no longer pierced the room. It ricocheted. Kash didn't respond immediately. He let the pause breathe, and then he delivered the sentence that ended it all. "Culture isn't something you gatekeep. It's something you build together." A few audience members gasped, others nodded, and Caroline, she froze, because that was the moment she realized she had walked into this room thinking she was the future of American politics. But now, she was just a cautionary tale. Her words, her image, her message, once polished to go viral, were already slipping out of her control. And Kash, he never raised his voice, he never left his seat, but he had just redefined what patriotism looks like on national television. Caroline blinked again, this time faster. Her eyes darted downward toward the folder like it might close itself. She reached for her microphone, but her hand trembled just enough for the audience to notice, and that's when it happened. Not a breakdown, not a scream, something worse. She tried to recover. This is ridiculous," she said, forcing a laugh that didn't land. "You think some century-old paperwork makes a point about American values?" But the room didn't laugh with her, because Kash hadn't used history to disqualify her. He had used it to disarm her. And her weapons, her words, her smirk, her sharp retorts had all vanished. "My family built a life here the right way," she added, voice cracking. "We earned our place." "So did mine," Kash replied quietly. It wasn't a rebuttal, it was a eulogy for the illusion she brought into that room. Anderson Cooper looked between them, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. The producers in the control room had stopped, arguing. The feed was live, the world was watching. Caroline scrambled to reframe. "This is about culture," she said, voice rising now. "About knowing what America stands for without having to read it in a textbook." She leaned forward again, trying to recapture the energy that used to make headlines. But the audience had already moved on. Their eyes weren't on her anymore. They were on Kash. Still seated, still calm, still unshaken, because power had shifted, and, not with a scream, but with a whisper, Caroline's arguments no longer sounded passionate, they sounded panicked. Her posture no longer looked strong, it looked defensive. She wasn't leading a movement, she was clinging to a script that had just collapsed under the weight of its own hypocrisy. And worst of all, she knew it. The girl who once commanded press rooms with fire and fury was now fumbling, caught between defiance and defeat. She reached for one last line, one last attempt to salvage control. "This country is changing too fast," she said, "and people are scared." Kash tilted his head, not cruelly but curiously. "Maybe," he said, "but fear doesn't justify erasing the people who built the road you're walking on." Caroline's mouth tightened, not into a smile, into a shield. But it was too late for armor. Her mask had slipped, her lines were exhausted, and the silence she once used as a weapon was now circling back at her like a verdict, because Kash hadn't just answered her. He had exposed her, not with slurs, not with rage, but with receipts and the real damage. It wasn't just what he said. It was the fact that everyone else in the room already knew it was true. One by one, the audience's expressions changed, not in unison, but in momentum. A slow erosion of confidence in her, a slow shift of trust. Toward him, she felt it, and for the first time in the debate, she looked not at Kash, but at the cameras. She was no longer speaking to him. She was trying to salvage her narrative, to reach the audience at home before the story wrote itself. "I'm not against immigrants," she said suddenly. "But we have to protect our culture. We have to preserve what makes America, America." Her voice had that edge again, but it no longer pierced the room. It ricocheted. Kash didn't respond immediately. He let the pause breathe. And then he delivered the sentence that ended it all. "Culture isn't something you gatekeep. It's something you build together." A few audience members gasped, others nodded, and Caroline, she froze, because that was the moment she realized she had walked into this room thinking she was the future of American politics. But now, she was just a cautionary tale. Her words, her image, her message, once polished to go viral, were already slipping out of her control. And Kash, he never raised his voice, he never left his seat, but he had just redefined what patriotism looks like on national television. The debate had barely ended when the internet detonated. CNN didn't cut to commercial. They couldn't. What had just happened wasn't a segment. It was a cultural earthquake. By the time Anderson Cooper thanked the guests and faded into the post-show panel, it was already too late. The clip was everywhere. Kash Patel shuts down Caroline Leavitt in 90 seconds. Immigrant son delivers most powerful debate rebuttal of the decade. This is America. Within 10 minutes, hashtags flooded every platform. Built by immigrants. Patel 2025. Caroline collapsed. People weren't just watching, they were choosing sides. On Twitter, the reactions turned into testimony. "My father came here from Ethiopia." That line from Kash, "Culture isn't something you gatekeep," I cried. "Caroline just lost me forever. You don't get to question someone's Americanness because they don't look like you." That folder Kash opened? That was every brown kid's quiet revenge. Even those who disagreed with his politics found themselves stunned by the clarity of the moment. It wasn't partisan, it was principled. Ben Shapiro tweeted, reluctantly but directly, "I don't always agree with Kash Patel. But tonight, he gave a masterclass in what it means to be American." Van Jones called it the single most important moment on live TV since George Floyd's murder sparked a movement. And perhaps most surprisingly, even Fox News, who had once propped up Caroline as a rising star, wavered. Tucker Carlson opened his show with a pause, then said, "You can disagree with a man's policies. You can challenge his facts. But when that man calmly disarms a racist attack with nothing but truth and history, that's not spin, that's leadership." For Kash, the texts came in non-stop, from generals, from journalists, From strangers. He didn't respond to most. He didn't need to, because this wasn't about victory. It was about exposure. And Caroline? Her world started shrinking by the hour. Campaign donors went quiet. Endorsements began to re-evaluate. 3 members of her own team resigned within 48 hours. 2 of them, children of immigrants. She held a press conference the next morning, flanked by American flags and the few staffers she had left. "I misspoke," she said. "My intention was to speak about cultural values, not question Mr. Patel's patriotism." But the clip said otherwise, and America had already made up its mind, because this wasn't just a gaffe, it was a glimpse behind the curtain, and no amount of rebranding could make people forget what they saw when the mask slipped. If this moment hit you like it hit millions of others, share this video right now. Let the world see what it looks like when truth wins without shouting. Drop a comment. What did Kash's response mean to you? And make sure you subscribe, because this is just one story in a movement that's only beginning. Caroline's press conference didn't repair the damage. It replayed it. Every word she spoke was weighed against the footage that had now been viewed over 30 million times. Her apology wasn't an act of accountability. It was an attempt to stop the bleeding, but the wound was already cultural. And Kash, he didn't say much after the debate. He didn't need to. While Caroline scrambled to explain, America was already rewriting the narrative. College professors assigned the exchange as required, viewing in courses on rhetoric and modern identity. Podcasters broke down the body language frame by frame. Memes flooded Instagram. One showed Kash calmly sitting with the caption, "When truth walks in wearing a tie." But the most powerful response didn't come from pundits. It came from people, Vietnamese veterans, Nigerian small business owners, Polish nurses, Mexican teachers, Korean factory workers. They flooded comment sections with their own stories of belonging. My dad never raised his voice either. He just worked, just like Kash. This wasn't a clapback, this was a generational answer. That folder, that was for all of us who've been told we're still becoming American. The line between left and right blurred, if only. For a moment, because what Kash had delivered wasn't partisan. It was something older, something deeper, a reminder that Americanness isn't an inheritance. It's a choice, a commitment, a contribution. And for Caroline Leavitt, that truth was kryptonite. Her donors didn't just pause, they vanished. One PAC released a statement condemning language that contradicts the inclusive promise of American conservatism. Another simply said, "We back fighters, not bigots." Her campaign office emptied. Her polling numbers plummeted. Her staff started fielding calls from journalists, not about policies but about resignations. And all the while, Kash stayed silent. No gloating, no retaliation tour. Just one quiet appearance on NPR, where he was asked if he'd accept an apology. "She doesn't owe me one," he said. "She owes one to the people she erased." That line, it hit harder than anything he said on the debate stage, because it wasn't about him anymore. It was about the thousands, no millions of Americans who finally saw themselves on national TV and realized they didn't have to justify their place here ever again. Kash didn't announce anything. He didn't start a podcast, didn't launch a foundation, didn't even tweet. But something had shifted. In coffee shops, classrooms, churches, people were quoting him. Not the policy points, not the folder, that one quiet line. Culture isn't something you gatekeep. It's something you build together. It echoed across communities like scripture. In swing states, town halls started drawing new kinds of questions. In conservative districts, candidates were suddenly asked where they stood on earned patriotism. Political consultants took notice. Focus groups lit up. What Kash had said wasn't new, but how he said it, when he said it, made it impossible to dismiss. Because he hadn't shamed anyone. He had simply told the truth. And that truth spread like Wildfire immigrant veterans began writing op-eds titled, "I Am America Too." Public school students made TikToks connecting their family history to Kash's. A third-grade teacher in Texas printed his quote and pinned it above her whiteboard. Service over ancestry, contribution over entitlement. Even within the Republican Party, fractured and uncertain, something started to bend. A congressman from Utah released a statement praising Kash for reminding us what conservatism looks like when it chooses courage over cruelty. In South Carolina, a gubernatorial candidate shifted her messaging to include inclusive nationalism, a phrase no one had dared say publicly 6 months earlier. It wasn't just about Kash anymore. It was about what Kash had revealed. The quiet dignity, the refusal to lash out, the precision of truth as resistance. It became a blueprint, and not just for politics, for identity. Because in a nation obsessed with shouting, Kash had reminded people what it means to win without raising your voice. That folder, it became a symbol, a TikTok trend, a street mural, a history lesson. "Bring the folder," students chanted during a university protest against anti-immigrant rhetoric. "Bring the truth." And Caroline, she became the cautionary tale, the name no one wanted to be compared to. Even her allies whispered phrases like Leavitt moment, a euphemism for when ambition outruns decency. But the more interesting shift wasn't in her downfall. It was in the rise of voices that had always been here, but had never been heard like this, because Kash didn't just change the debate, he changed who gets to shape it, and he did it without asking for permission. No campaign manager told him how to phrase it. No focus group approved the tone. No consultant prepped him with polling data. He didn't speak to win votes. He spoke to reclaim something that had been slipping from the country's grasp. Moral clarity, that rare, endangered thing, the kind you feel in your bones before you understand it with your mind. And America felt it. Even those who disagreed with his politics paused, because something in the way he carried truth, measured, unflinching, unscripted, cut through the noise. It wasn't the kind of moment you could manufacture. It was the kind of moment that manufactures movements. By the end of the week, a high school civics teacher in Wisconsin played the clip before starting a unit on the Constitution. Small newspaper in Nebraska ran the headline, "Immigrant Son Reclaims the Flag Without Raising His Voice." And in Washington, that silence made the loudest noise. Political operatives left and right began redrawing their internal messaging. They weren't just studying Kash's comeback, they were dissecting his restraint, because that's what unsettled them the most. He didn't grandstand, he didn't play victim, he didn't make it about revenge, he made it about responsibility. "My father never asked America to accept him," he had said during a quiet post-debate interview. "He just worked until it had no choice." That sentence traveled farther than any campaign slogan, because in a time when everyone is shouting to be heard, Kash had chosen something else: stillness. And somehow it thundered louder than any mic drop. It wasn't performative, it was elemental, and it reminded a divided country of something it had forgotten. The most dangerous man in the room isn't the one yelling. It's the one who knows exactly when to speak and what truth to leave ringing in the silence that follows. The system moved fast. It always does when it senses it's losing control. Within days of the debate, the political machinery that Kash Patel had disrupted began reassembling itself. Think tanks released papers. Talking heads reframed the moment as emotional manipulation. Anonymously sourced articles surfaced, suggesting Kash had prepared the takedown, as if preparation was now a crime. But it was too late. They weren't just reacting to a man, they were reacting to a mirror, one that had shown America something uncomfortable, that patriotism doesn't need to scream, that the flag doesn't belong to whoever yells the loudest. Caroline Leavitt's allies tried to do damage control. They floated the idea that she had been taken out of context, that she had been baited. But the tape didn't lie, and neither did her silence in the days that followed. She wasn't just losing endorsements, she was losing the story. And that's what hurt them most, because in American politics, the story is the currency. For decades, legacy politicians had sold the myth that heritage equals loyalty, that American bloodlines carry more weight than American choices, that you could wrap cruelty in the flag and call it tradition. Kash broke that frame in one sitting. And now the legacy class scrambled to build a new one. They tried to say he was too polished. They suggested he had foreign sensibilities. A former senator even muttered on live radio, "Just because someone serves doesn't mean they understand what this country truly feels like." The backlash wasn't subtle, but it wasn't working, because America wasn't listening to them anymore. They were listening to veterans who looked like Kash, to teachers quoting his words, to single mums from immigrant families who had never seen someone like them win an argument so quietly and completely. And Kash, he didn't respond to the attacks. He went back to work, appeared at a veterans hospital, visited a community college in Arizona, took no victory lap because he didn't come to run. He came to remind. And as he stepped off stages across the country, the crowds grew, not because he promised anything, but because he proved something, that patriotism doesn't have to be loud, it just has to be real. And for the political class that had built its power on volume, rage, and inherited symbolism, that was the real threat, not Kash Patel's words, his silence. Because in Washington, silence isn't just a pause, it's a power move. And when used right, it doesn't just shift the room. It rattles the entire architecture. Kash didn't need to defend himself from the whispers. He knew where they came from. He'd seen it before. The system was never built to reward stillness. It rewards sound, noise, distraction. But Kash had offered something else, something they couldn't. Co-opt stillness as accountability. It terrified them, because how do you discredit someone who won't fight back in the way you're used to? How do you corner a man who already stood in every shadow they tried to use against him? They tried everything. Cable. Networks quietly reduced replays of the clip. Party leaders pushed backdoor efforts to reframe the moment as a fluke. Think pieces emerged arguing that emotion shouldn't outweigh policy. But the people weren't buying it, because for the first time in years, they had seen something unscripted, something real, something that looked like America. Not as it's marketed, but as it's lived. Kash wasn't supposed to be a hero. He wasn't media-friendly in the conventional sense. Too calm, too brown, too hard to define. And that was the point. He didn't fit their mold, so they tried to ignore him. But how do you ignore someone who already slipped into the bloodstream? In classrooms, young debate teams replayed his responses. In churches, pastors quoted him in sermons about grace under fire. In union halls, workers spoke his name beside phrases like earned respect. The legacy fight wasn't just about Kash anymore. It was about control of the narrative, and they were losing it, because Kash hadn't asked to lead anything. He had just told the truth, and people had followed, not because of charisma, but because of clarity. He didn't wave the flag to claim it. He carried it quietly, through action, through sacrifice, through silence. And that kind of patriot, you don't see him coming. But once he arrives, you can't imagine the country without him. Some moments erupt, others settle in like a slow burn. What Kash delivered wasn't just a clapback, it was a shift in gravitational pull. He didn't argue for inclusion, he demonstrated belonging, and that kind of proof, earned, not inherited, doesn't fade with headlines. Lingers in classrooms, in campaign meetings, in backrooms where the old guard whispers, "We can't let that happen again." But it already has, because once truth escapes the script, once dignity outperforms drama, once a quiet man shows the country who it really is, you don't just change the conversation, you change the terms. The system doesn't change overnight. It pretends it didn't hear you first, but silence isn't always ignorance. Sometimes it's fear, and after Kash Patel's moment, the fear was real, not because he had exposed a scandal, not because he'd made noise, but because he had disrupted the architecture of who gets to define American legitimacy, and done it without asking for permission. In legal circles, conversations began to shift. Judges cited public climate in immigration cases, referencing the debate clip indirectly. One appellate court opinion quoted Kash's line, "Service over ancestry," without attribution, as if it had seeped into doctrine before anyone could control it. In Congress, proposed bills once framed around border control were now layered with language about earned citizenship and contributive identity. Lobbyists scrambled to keep up. It wasn't policy yet, but it was presence, and presence, when it won't sit where you tell it, becomes power. At Ivy League universities, political science students wrote dissertations titled "Stillness as Strategy." The Patel Doctrine, one law school made the debate clip part of its ethics seminar. In corporate boardrooms, DEI programs, once performative checklists, suddenly looked flat against the weight of Kash's unspoken example. One Fortune 100 CEO was overheard asking, "Why didn't we find someone like that?" The answer was simple. They weren't looking, because Kash wasn't polished for optics. He was sharpened by experience, and experience, real, unsanitized, immigrant-rooted, was finally being understood not as a footnote, but as a framework. Even Hollywood circled in. A major streaming service greenlit a docuseries titled The Debate, centered around the viral confrontation, with Kash's team declining creative control. He wanted no edits, just truth, and beneath all the headlines, the institutions that had quietly shaped public belief for generations, textbooks, cable news, political platforms, began revising their language, not by choice, by necessity. Because Kash hadn't just shaken one ideology, he had rattled the scaffolding beneath them all. The right could no longer claim immigrant patriotism was incompatible with nationalism. The left could no longer assume that dignity had to come dressed in outrage. And for every system built to divide identity into boxes, Kash had shown up as a contradiction they couldn't file away. He didn't check their boxes, he burned them, not through protest, through presence, and that presence, the kind that doesn't beg for inclusion, but arrives already belonging, was now replicating in places that weren't built for it. At the Pentagon, junior officers cited Kash's moment during diversity briefings, not to meet quotas, but to reset the conversation. "This is who we're fighting for," one captain said, pointing to the clip, "not the polished, the proven." In churches, pastors who had once danced around nationalism now wrestled with it in sermons. How do you preach unity when silence in the face of insult becomes the loudest gospel? In think tanks, identity policy papers began with disclaimers. We recognize the limitations of heritage-based frameworks, because now there was precedent, and in state houses, from Michigan to Georgia, freshman legislators carried Kash's calm like a new weapon, fact over fire, service over slogans, stillness over spectacle. It unsettled veterans of the game, because for decades, American identity had been theater, flags at rallies, bloodline rhetoric, dog whistles dressed as discourse. But Kash had pulled the curtain, and what lay behind wasn't rage, it was responsibility. He had walked into a televised ambush and walked out with something no strategist could engineer, credibility born in public and too clear to spin. They tried to drown it out. Flood the airwaves with counterclips, push shiny new faces forward with safer, simpler stories. But it didn't work, Because once America hears something real, truly real, it starts listening differently. You could feel it in the campaign ads, suddenly laced with humility. In university debates where earned patriotism wasn't a fringe idea, it was the standard. And most of all, you could feel it in the silence, the one Kash left behind, not empty, not hollow, charged. The headlines faded, the hashtags stopped trending, but something else took their place, a quiet. Not the silence of forgetting, the silence of remembering Kash. Patel didn't ride the wave, he stepped off it, declined the speaking tour, turned down book deals, refused the temptation to turn a moment into a brand. Because for him, this was never about a microphone, it was about a mirror. And once that mirror had been held up to the country, he didn't need to keep standing in front of it. The country saw itself, in the reflections of janitors who built futures with aching hands, of daughters translating tax forms for their parents in grocery store parking lots, of veterans whose uniforms didn't protect them from being asked where they were really from. And in that reflection, they saw Kash, not as a symbol, as a standard. What he proved couldn't be rebranded, that sometimes the most American thing you can do is say nothing until the truth is needed, and then speak so clearly that the echo never leaves. In the months that followed, something subtle shifted. A mayor in Tulsa rewrote a citizenship oath to include the words, "by service, not by blood." A middle school in Detroit renamed its civics building the Patel Hall of Belonging. And on Veterans Day, a group of Afghan-American soldiers held up a poster that read, "He spoke for us." Kash never reposted it. He never mentioned it. He just kept moving, one city to the next. One quiet visit to a community center, one handshake at a food bank. No cameras, no slogans, just presence. Because in the America he represented, greatness doesn't shout. It shows up, does the work, and lets the truth speak for itself. There's something strange about silence. It unnerves us at first. In a world built on algorithms and outrage, we expect volume. We're conditioned to confuse noise with meaning. But every once in a while, someone reminds us of the opposite, that there's a different kind of power, one that doesn't interrupt the room, but rearranges it. That's what Kash Patel did. He didn't debate to win. He didn't speak to be applauded. He didn't carry his heritage like a banner or his service like a shield. He just stood his ground, quietly, firmly, and without fear. And in doing so, he reminded an entire country what patriotism sounds like when it doesn't need permission to exist. What followed wasn't just a reaction, it was a recognition that maybe America had been asking the wrong question all along. Not who belongs here, but what do we owe to those who already do? The answer didn't come in policy. It didn't come in sound bites. It came in stillness, in that breath between accusation and reply, in the folder placed gently on the table, in the history unspooled, not to shame, but to clarify. Kash didn't humiliate his opponent. He didn't need to. The truth was enough, because the truth, when carried with grace, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be heard. And it was. By the student trying to prove they belong in the classroom. By the parent, working 3 jobs and still being asked for their papers. By the veteran who fought for a country that still spells their name wrong on official forms. They all heard it, and something opened inside them. Not rage, not vengeance, but space. Space to breathe, to belong, to no longer explain, because what Kash gave them wasn't just representation, it was rest from having to justify, from having to fight, from having to prove again and again what had already been earned. So maybe that's the legacy, not the folder, not the takedown, not even the viral clip, but the invitation to build a version of America where silence is no longer suspicion, but strength, where identity is not performance, but presence, where the most American voice in the room might just be the one that doesn't need to raise itself to be heard. And maybe, if we're lucky, we'll learn to listen. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe truth still matters, subscribe for more stories that silence the noise.